to the Weather Report with Yorgo Lykouria, Creative Director and Founder of Rainlight Studio. In this issue, we welcome Elizabeth Glickfeld, co-founder and editor of Dirty Furniture, as well as an independent design writer and lecturer.
So good afternoon, Elizabeth. Lovely to have you on the Weather Report.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. What I find fascinating about Dirty Furniture is that you don't have a strict timeline. And to me, that means that you just wait until the content is right and sort of perfected before you put out the next issue, which I think is really quite an unusual approach, but I really appreciate that because it means that quality of content is optimized.
We're definitely a slow design magazine. We're probably slower than we would want to be. But, I guess we do intentionally want a slow news cycle because we are about, Dirty Furniture is a platform for contemporary design writing. And it is a platform for contemporary long form design writing. So I guess that slowness is very integral to its concept, because we're not really about the latest design or a press release or the creation myth behind a design. We're more focused on the meaning of design when it's used in the real world.
I think that's really healthy because it's a sort of step back, isn't it? You see the sort of longer, the longer tendencies of design. It's like, every year we have so many trade shows and this idea that design is moving at the speed of light, like fashion, right? And I don't know that it is. I think we might force it to move that fast, but maybe it's not moving as fast as that.
Well, I think the festival circuit and, the press circuit actually fosters that fast sense of time. And what's been really interesting in having started a magazine 6 years ago is that now in retrospect, we look at some of the pieces which we thought were quite futuristic at the time. And, we can really see the sort of speed of the now. Things that seemed to be sort of wild speculation 6 years ago seem to have come into being very quickly. So I guess part of publishing the magazine is really considering what is the now, how long is the now?
It's a very good question. What is the now? I mean, now is something that we might not be aware of anymore, but I think the way that you're approaching it might remind us that there is a now. Again, I think that longer view is really quite healthy. I applaud you. I think it's brilliant what you're doing. I think it's also very, very daring to have this sort of tempo that follows, a different rhythm that, it's not just fixed to a calendar, a cycle. So I think that's really very healthy on our side. I think it's a good counterpoint to the speed and the tempo that we're living in. It seems more and more, with the Industrial Revolution and the clock and this kind of regimented aspect of life, we thought we gave it up when the digital revolution came along, but I think the opposite has happened. I think we're even more tied to the clock and to the calendar. So what you're doing is a great antidote to the kind of lives that we're living and providing, I think, a very healthy and rich perspective to the world of design. Just a question: why is it called Dirty Furniture? I never asked you that.
The magazine is called Dirty Furniture because it is about the meaning of design in the world and what happens when we use design. Therefore, what happens when we use something, it gets dirty.
So today we're going to talk about the phone. It's such an important part of our lives, and yet it's a relatively new thing for humanity. If we go back through those 100,000 years, it's only in the last sort of 150 years that we've been communicating via remote communication, first with the radio and telex and things like that. And suddenly now we all have this thing in our pocket that allows us to communicate in so many different ways. I did a film called Verona, which was based on Romeo and Juliet. It was a shortened version of the Shakespeare play. And there's the moment when, the fateful moment when Juliet, or a message is sent to Romeo and he doesn't get it because it's a man on a horse, and that's the whole unraveling of the story. And I had to figure out how to interpret that in today's time, and it was basically around the mobile phone. And effectively at that moment he's being accosted by Capulet's thugs, and they throw his phone into the Thames, and that's the end of that. So he misses the message, he doesn't get it. And that's kind of the world we're in today. We're so dependent on our phones and perhaps addicted to them. And I know that in the fall, you're going to be, Dirty Furniture will be launching the next issue, and it's all about the phone. So I wondered if maybe we can start with addiction and the phone.
Well, it's funny that you should mention that, because in putting together this issue of Dirty Furniture, which we've been doing, which has coincided with the onset of the pandemic, it's really sort of made us constantly interrogate this sort of metaphor of addiction that we have in relation to phones. Because on the one hand, we have that sort of medicalized metaphor, which conceives of our relationship with the phone as being addictive, yet we're publishing this magazine during a time when we have really been more dependent than ever on our phones, because we've all been physically sort of confined to our homes. And it sort of led us to kind of consider, well, how can we, in the magazine, even conceive of a more productive relationship with our phones, or sort of, are there other metaphors, and as a design magazine, how are we designing our relationships with our phones?
Yeah, well, we're reading the news on our phones as well as communicating, for one, right? And I think most people are getting information in that way. Is that maybe part of the addiction? It's a kind of lifeline, isn't it? It connects us to the wider world, and it's wherever we are, we're not having to be in a specific place. So there's a kind of nomadic freedom that comes with that as well. But yet at the same time, we're constantly tethered in some way. And so is that maybe part of the addiction, the constant pinging that is reminding us of a wider connection? There's something magic about it in a way. Again, looking back through human history, there was a time when we would have had to use our intuition more. There was Carl Jung writes about synchronicity, this idea that different things happen in different parts of the world that are connected causally, but yet they're meaningful. And I think there was a lot more reference to that sort of almost extrasensory perception, which in a way gets turned off when we start to replace it with a phone, because now you can just call. I was just thinking about you, and a call comes in, right? So we still have that, but yet the technology has in a way replaced that human perception of reality that we used to have, I think.
Yeah, I think it's also, in a funny way, while it brings us closer together, I think because it's sort of given us such a sort of fragmented experience of things, like we all have our own experiences of the news we digest and the things we jump to from one or the other, it means that we sort of don't have those common experiences of rituals as sort of a presumption behind our day. Like if you think about a daily printed newspaper, everybody would refer to the same source of news, and that is sort of like a unifying aspect. But now, because we have such a personal relationship to our phones and the information we access to them, in some ways, while it does, as you say, bring us closer together, and make communication more direct, it's also atomized our own sort of experiences.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is relevant, and I think that part of that is it contributes, I suppose, to, as you say, the fragmentation of experience, which might become a fragmentation of culture, of values. In a way, it has the potential to unify as well, in either a good or bad way. I don't think there's a judgment on that. It could go both ways, depending on the influence of culture, I suppose. But it also has it is fragmenting, especially, the analogy I always refer to is music, because, since everything became, music has gone online and it's streamed, suddenly there are so many bands, because I used to ask people, so what kind of music are you into? And people would I stopped asking people because they would tell me names of bands that I've never heard of. And so I gave up asking because there's so many bands, so many acts, and that's part of that.
But it's the same comparison to the printed newspaper. I mean, 30 years ago, there was one number one for the week, and everybody knew what that number one on the charts was. It sort of makes experience richer and more diverse, which is fantastic. But I guess there's swings and roundabouts. There's a counterbalance to that. Yeah.
Do you think that brings us closer together, that kind of diversity of experience? Do you think it makes it? I mean, in a way, everybody becomes a stranger somehow. This idea of a tribe could potentially get fragmented. If you think about living in a city, so you're in Melbourne, I'm in London, and you're walking down the street, and if you look at old photographs, there was a sense of, I don't know, almost homogeneity. I think, at least that's my impression, right? If you see old city photos, there was a sense of, visual unity. Some people looked a certain way, and now we're not like that anymore. And so, in a way, maybe we become strangers to each other over the course of the digital revolution, by virtue of that fragmentation of the experience.
Well, I think we have to accept that community doesn't just happen in physical spaces. While there is a lot of writing about tech, which sort of, looks at that image of the person who's walking down the street, with their headphones and looking down at their phone, completely distracted from their physical surroundings, it doesn't mean that they're not developing some sense of community or commonality with other people through other means.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
That's brilliant, because that leads to this big question of the human being and the environment, the relevance of architecture and design. When people are disconnected from the physical environments in that way, and they're connected to a virtual community, it could be damaging as opposed to the lived experience, in the sense that your real experience is played out in your mind, rather than through the physical experience of the space you're in, through your bodily senses, right? Because you're looking at something, your mind your attention is on that, and you're listening to a different space, and it completely takes you away from. It's a kind of lived virtual reality, isn't it? I mean, this whole, or augmented reality in a way, and yet it's something that we are experiencing every day. I mean, what do you feel about that? Do you think that this is good for us? Do you think that it's creating? Because ultimately, that's the question. How is this affecting our culture? How is that affecting the evolution of humanity, of community, of civilization?
I guess when you mention those things, I was sort of just thinking about, it would be good to know what scientific research has been done into how our interaction with the phone has actually affected the sort of development of our biological senses. I think sort of in the phone issue of Dirty Furniture, we've got a piece by Paul Elliman, and he's written this kind of prehistory to the phone, which looks at sort of the essential functions of the phone. So he's looking at navigation and all these things which people used to do without phone, and how people, oriented themselves in space and, physically and sort of biologically without the use of technology. So I guess I'm not answering your question about community, but, we've got these sort of prostheses, which, you know, I suspect will profoundly affect how we are designed. You know, I mean, you know, will we lose the capacity to follow, to you know, to really follow a map, you know, with GPS? You know, I mean, that's the most, you know,
or
you know,
memory,
what,
or memory,
well,
right? I mean,
yeah,
I meet a lot of people, they don't even know
another
they
one,
don't know
yeah,
their phone numbers, and they have to look up their own phone numbers when they find
yeah,
extraordinary.
yeah, yeah. So I think that that's sort of more what your question, you know, the community thing I find really, really difficult to, I guess, take a stance on, because I just think it's, yeah, I think there is a loss of that physical, that sense of community and physical space. But, you know, the upshot is there's been a lot of communities which have, you know, been allowed to sort of grow up and sort of thrive online, which are sort of, you know, really do help, you know, a diverse range of people and foster, you know, different sort of cultures and subcultures.
Yeah. I mean, there's something. So Paul Virilio, he's, you know, architect and thinker, philosopher. He writes a lot about that. I mean, he laments about what's happening to our, what happened, or what is happening to our world. I mean, he's passed away now. He, you know, he writes a lot about the effects of mass media, technology, communication, and things like that, and how it's detrimental. You know, and Merleau-Ponty writes about experience, right? And as an essential human thing that has completely changed. You know, I think depending on who you talk to, people will say either the phone has increased our ability to experience a variety of things. Other people might say it's decreased our ability to appreciate the moment, the lived experience, you know. And that's maybe part of the question, but back to the phone, it is all about the phone. The phone has facilitated that, right? That connection to the internet, really. I mean, the iPhone, right? It was,
yeah,
you know, that kind of jump started, I think. I mean, the smartphones were already brewing, but the iPhone was really the device that began the revolution to say we're plugging into the internet and we're going to live there in this digital sphere. And, you know, this hyper functionality that comes with this device has given us that ability to practically live there, right? I mean, especially through the pandemic, as you say, we've become more reliant on our phones, and that means, you know, as we come out of this, maybe we'll stay there, you know, living in that virtual world or not. I hope not, but ultimately that is a possibility. So, you know, when we talk about experience and design, one of the things that I was, you know, since I did my degree in architecture, I was always very interested in the experience of architecture and what that means. And, you know, with humanism in the Renaissance period and the three-point perspective, you know, there was suddenly this ability to visualize physical space and putting the human in the center of that. And then, you know, then we have, you know, McLuhan, and he talks about the all at onceness of our lives, and where it all goes from there is really now up for grabs, because suddenly our centeredness in the world, in the universe, which used to be visual, now seems to have gone inward, and now it's something that plays out more in our minds, because we're not seeing anymore. We're not seeing the spaces that we're in as much as we used to.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I think that we're less visual or more visual, because some people would argue that, yeah, we don't experience physical space probably in the same way that we do, but yet our interaction with smartphones really does, you know, in some ways privilege the image.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm thinking that, you know, I guess the, you know, success of architectural space is often, you know, through the media judged by what they look like in an image, you know, which opens up a whole other can of worms.
So what do you think about that? What do you think about that? Like, are there spaces that you think are better in the real or better in the photograph that you've experienced? What do you think about that? How does the image stack up to the thing?
I would hope that, as a design writer, I mean, I'm not an architecture writer, I'm a design writer, but, I always hope that, if I read a piece of architectural writing, that it will impart some experience of the space, which you can't get just by seeing a two-dimensional image of it. And I guess I always think the architectural spaces that I love the most or value the most are architectural spaces that I guess, change your sort of spiritual and bodily experience. I mean, probably I don't know, if you look at an image of architecture and your experience of the space doesn't match up to the image, or your experience in the space is worse than the image, well, then what does that say?
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's a strange thing. Like if you think about, the Gothic Cathedral is a brilliant example. There's also spaces like let's say Tadao Ando, the Japanese architect Tadao Ando, which are so minimal. Okay, and you take a picture and you see this beautiful concrete wall, and because there's a shaft of light over it, it becomes poetic in the image. If you didn't have that shaft of light, it's just a concrete wall, and you kind of think, so what? But when you're standing in a space from Tadao Ando, it's just beautiful, right? It's just something that happens when you're there. So that over-reliance on the image, again, it's a question of what will happen. Obviously, we're old enough to have experienced the real world prior to all this, so we may be, we're sort of hybrid beings, right? We're not completely native to the digital world, and maybe that's why we're talking about this. But for the next generation who are going to be more reliant or addicted or whatever it is to the phone, it'd be interesting to know how their thinking evolves. Will there still be that lived sense of poetry, I guess, that you can get when everything becomes virtualized and reduced to a two-dimensional image on a phone or a device of some kind? To know, it remains to be seen, I suppose.
But then I guess because they are digital natives, they might not know what they're missing out on.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Yeah, it's a thing. And granted, we're probably missing out on stuff that, prior generations have, right? So that's life. You lose some, you gain some. So maybe it's not much to lament. So talking about the object itself, in our last conversation, you were referring to it as, referring to the violence of the origins of the phone, which I thought was very kind of powerful. And it kept me thinking about the violence of the origin of the phone. And do you remember that?
Yes, I do, because it actually comes from an essay that we're publishing by Jay Owens.
Okay.
And she's looking at, she started with this premise in this essay of she wanted to look at why everyone calls iPhones sexy. And she goes into this narrative of, we have this sort of alluring minimalism, which at the same time is sort of fragile, like we like to protect our phones, but that this sort of minimalism obscures like a whole range of sort of, as we know, the minerals it takes to mine, the working conditions, all of these things to produce this sort of beautiful sort of monolith. And she says there is this violence lurking between the iPhone, but then again, if we were to, she brings up the idea of the virtuous phone as the phone that has a broken screen and which we can get repaired. And what is that primal instinct in us that for a lot of people that's not appealing? The good phone is the virtuous phone. And, it comes back to her idea of sort of what's sexy and allure, which is all tied into our sort of fetishization of this object.
It is, yeah, it is a fetish, isn't it? And I think part of that might be, as you say, that allure, that mystery. You called it a monolith. It's like 2001: Space Odyssey from Stanley Kubrick. That monolith that I think we still don't know what it means, or at least, there are lots of interpretations of what that monolith is. It might be the mobile phone, for us, but it's that kind of mystery that, again, opens a portal to this digital world, right? And not being able to access it does become something quasi-religious in the sense of inviolate space that you cannot enter, like the altar of a church or a temple, or that there's only a certain group of people who are allowed there because they're holy, and in a way, maybe that's part of it. It's that idea that you cannot enter this machine, and it's the interface stops there. I mean, that's how it's become. And I wonder if that's part of the magic in it, because it goes to lots of things, even cars. You can't really fix your own car anymore, right? It used to be that you could open up the bonnet and, change something. Nowadays, it's you need a computer to do it. Everything's wired. And similarly with computers, especially the new Apple computers, which tend to be, again, inviolate. You can't really do a lot with them. Although I think they're changing that now. So it'd be interesting to see what happens. But that's a really compelling point. And I think you also talked about it as an inscrutable object, which I think is part of that, that mystery. What is the phone? What is the phone really, apart from this device for communication that we become so attached to, dependent on? People panic when they leave the house and they've forgotten their phone. Imagine that we can't live without it.
But I think, to most of us, they're more and more unknowable. They facilitate communication, but I mean, how many of us really understand what's going on inside, what's going on inside them? And I think that's quite profound for our relationship with technology.
Do you feel comfortable with that relationship?
No, but I think, again, it's one that we have to, I mean, who would? But I guess, you're talking about that, it's not the Renaissance anymore. That humanist perspective is where it's that, that 3-point perspective with the human at the center. I mean, everything that's going on in the world is profoundly challenging that.
Do you think it's worth trying to recover that, or do you think we're already down the rabbit hole?
I suspect we're probably already down the rabbit hole. I don't know. What do you think?
I'm trying to recover it. And it might be a losing battle, I confess. And it's kind of, I might die a hero's death, trying, but nonetheless, I think that design is probably the only thing that can, save the world in the sense of bringing the real experience back to humanity. The challenge is that, the internet is wondrous. The imagery, the, high definition video in your pocket, right? It's incredible. 4D sound. I mean, it gives you so much sensorily, and yet I think architecture and design has failed and has allowed that to become a more alluring experience than the real experience. And I think the challenge now for architecture and design is, how do we up our game so that the real experience is something that's going to make people shut up and turn off their phone or put it away so that they could see what's around them, Like in, if somebody's walking in the woods, and if they go far enough, they're not going to have a signal anymore. So they have no choice but to put it away. Maybe that's good. And that's I think that's the kind of architecture that we need, the equivalent of taking a walk in the woods, where you have these sounds and scents and light changing shades of green and whatever else is there, and the bits of sky. That sort of wondrous experience that, I think we need. I think in a way, design is an antidote for a lot of things. It brings beauty into the world. And I think when there's beauty in the world, people are more content, at peace with themselves, and more likely to I think, have a good life. So yeah, I do worry about what these things are doing to us, and to our civilization. You know, I think design needs to be more highly valued. We need to appreciate the value that it brings, apart from it being called real estate, you know, that it's just giving us a return on an investment, which is fair enough. Money makes the world go round. It kind of always has, I think.
Yeah.
So nothing to change that. I think it's just applying it differently, and also realizing that there's with that power comes the responsibility to actually create real experiences in the world that we can all enjoy and be fully human in. So that's, I think that would be the sum of my quest, you know. So that's why design
I guess what I'm thinking is that, I guess, you know, designers, and, you know, even historically, and most designers you speak to always want to have the power and the responsibility to be able to design in a way that's human, and that meets the ideals that you're talking about. But, you know, I think in relation to the phone, in order to make it more human, you know, what are we talking about? What the design of what are we talking about? Because it's not the hardware anymore. It's not even the software. I mean, if we go back to the topic of the addiction, it's not like we can cure addiction just by designing a sunrise app. It goes much further into, well, why are we designing what we encounter in our phones to you know, to almost appear to the same impulses that would appeal to a gambler. I mean, that's, you know, very, you know, and you know, a lot of people would argue, and, you know, one of our writers is sort of arguing that we need to design the sort of regulations behind the sort of internet, you know, which does it so that it doesn't allow private interests to sort of masquerade as public forums, you know. So what do we want to be empowered to design in order to achieve this?
Yeah, I think it comes back to real life, back to the, you know, the design of the artifacts in our midst, in cities, the way we live, the way we work. You know, if you think about workplace, workplaces in a way, and it has been affected by the phone as well, because it's given us that freedom to work anywhere, to be anywhere. And so workplace is not a place anymore, as we know from the pandemic. Work is wherever you are. So it is an interesting kind of freedom, but yet it's, you know, when I realized that actually we don't have that much freedom, because especially now, every hour, you know, a bell goes off, means you have to be in another Zoom call. And, you know, it's a real tight leash, you know.
I mean, I'm always amazed that sort of people predicted, you know, that I guess people working from home and this Zoom thing would, you know, there were those people who sort of presaged, oh, it'll mean that we'll work less hours. And I just don't think it's sort of the opposite. It means the expectations of what we achieve and how productive we are, because we don't have to travel to work. It just means that the expectations sort of get higher, you know. And I guess, you know, the parallel to that is sort of, you know, the invention of sort of kitchen gadgets and vacuum cleaners and labor-saving devices. You know, I don't think it sort of alleviated sort of women's work in the home. It really just changed sort of standards of hygiene and sort of domestic standards. Yeah.
And by the way, it's not just women. Hey, I'm a cook and all that. So no, it's true. And to the kitchen analogy, has it made us better cooks? You know, having all these appliances, or do you just need a cutting board and a piece of garlic, you know, to make something happen?
Right. Yeah.
I don't know. You know, we talked about the last time the radiation aspects. of the phone and 5G that's on its way or here in some places. And what that's going to mean, it's going to mean that we're going to be able to get faster content and better connections wherever we are. It's coming through the airwaves. I know a lot of people, I mean, I honestly don't know a lot about 5G, apart from that it's a lot stronger and potentially the radiation is stronger. But I've heard a lot of people are really quite concerned about it. And what are your thoughts on 5G?
So we are publishing a piece by an architectural sort of critic named Andrea Bagnato, and he has written a piece which basically investigates a specific example of 5G, which in a particular place he's investigating the implementation of 5G in Matera. And apparently the policy for implementing this 5G was almost to sort of gentrify this region and to help this region with its economic development. But at the same time, he's sort of like is looking at how the implementation of 5G affects sort of our control over our own health. Because if the jury is still out there about the causation between the radiation and our health, and we're being sold this message that, you know, it's good for progress and productivity, then who really gets to choose, you know, who has the final say?
No, that's a big question. Who gets to choose?
Who gets to choose?
Yeah.
You know? Because there are people that do feel that, you know, that this is not just a conspiracy theory about 5G, that actually the research, the causation sort of has not been disproved. So, right. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's that's a tricky thing, isn't it? I mean, that's always a problem with, back to Paul Virilio, he always talks about technology and how technology creates the new potential for catastrophe, right? You know, the plane, the train, the automobile, and so on. And although he was always talking about things that are going fast, you know, the relationship of speed to our lives. But now we're in another domain, right? When we're talking about radiation that you cannot see, it becomes harder to prove the effects. Yeah, no, that's great. I wasn't aware that there was a conspiracy theory about 5G, although there's a conspiracy theory about everything these days, isn't there? It seems.
Conspiracy theories about everything. You know, I think there are some people who think the concerns about 5G are completely unfounded. Mm-hmm. So maybe conspiracy theory is not the right word, but you know, if you're living in a city and you think that the health implications have not really clearly been established, well then who has control over your health? I mean, you know, is it the individual? Is it the, you know?
Well, it's that's why we have elected governments, I suppose, right? We hand our trust over to them. So hopefully things get done in the right way. But yeah, no, that's an interesting problem. So Matera in Italy. So that's if you want to avoid 5G, you need to live in Matera, at least for the time being.
Well, I think the plan is still to implement it there. I don't know. You'd have to ask Andrea what the...
Okay. Yeah. And so how are things in Australia in terms of, you know, obviously our perspective from London and, you know, being surrounded by all these, you know, great European cities where there's a certain sort of speed, the kind of, especially if you're on the continent, right? This you know, the phone is augmented by a super fast train and that whole connectivity, that sort of freedom of movement and being everywhere at once that we are living right now in Europe, or like you two called Zooropa, right? I mean, it's brilliant. I always have the impression that Australia is more idyllic because you've got so much nature, and you know, balance between the city and nature is probably healthier, I suppose. How do you see it? Is that true?
I think Australians are just as dependent on their phones as everybody else.
Right.
There is a high quality of life, I guess, in terms because of the space. You know, I think for an architect, you know, there's more space to sort of build on. We are vast, but most people are, you know, most of the population are living, you know, on the coast in sort of cities. There's a lot of, I guess, untouched space, I would say, in Australia.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Good luck.
Bye.
Take care.